Welcome to The Beat. I'm Ari Melber, and we're doing something really special in tonight's broadcast. I always try to tell you up front when we got stuff cooking. We have been working as a team for a while on a special report we're going to show you tonight about these Trump-Musk cuts to the government and why it matters in the long term with an Erin Brockovich cameo. So that's coming up. We begin with these court fights that we've been covering over the Trump agenda. A federal judge today threatening to actually open a contempt probe against the Trump administration for defying the ruling that ordered those officials, you might recall, in that big clash over the flights to basically stop what the judge thought was and had ruled was likely an illegal deportation, to turn around the flight going to El Salvador. Judge Boasberg writing, the Trump administration's actions, quote, on that day demonstrate a willful disregard for its order. Probable cause exists to find the government in criminal contempt. We'll get back to that legal term, but you can see it's not good news for a Trump administration that's testing how much they can defy these rulings. The judge goes on to say the Constitution does not tolerate willful disobedience of judicial orders, and that to avoid contempt, the administration has to give proper due process of law to these detainees. You may recall that's something we've been covering. Whatever one thinks about the larger issues of immigration and how to do it, if you have a system that undercuts all American rights and rights of any other human who has human rights in this country, whatever their status, then everyone is at risk because they can send you to a foreign prison and then say, oops, as Marco Rubio posted online, oopsie, we can't do anything about it. We can't bring you back no matter who you are. So this is the big ongoing clash we've been reporting, and that judge's statement today is bad news for the Trump administration, but we'll have to see whether the Supreme Court holds the line. Now, you may recall the case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia at the center of the immigration battle about being erroneously deported. No factual dispute here. The Trump administration admits they sent him to the wrong place. He's stuck in a foreign prison unless and until they fix it. Here's how that has been playing out.
The judge overseeing the case has demanded the administration facilitate, that's their word, facilitate his return.
Trump's aides want to hide behind El Salvador and claim they suddenly have no power to do anything about this.
That's really a decision that will be made by the government of El Salvador.
I don't have the power to return him to the United States.
Stop playing political games with the life of Kilmer.
President Bukele does not want to give him back to the United States, nor do we want him back.
Right, so that's it. A guy gets sent to a country he doesn't want to go to. You know what? I can live with that.
Everyone from El Salvador knows what it means when you wear a Bulls hat. It means you're MS-13.
A federal judge in Maryland just excoriated Trump administration lawyers over the administration's refusal to comply with that order.
I think it's because the answer is they haven't been planning to do anything.
So what happens if there is no meaningful effort at compliance or even the bare minimum of asking for this individual to be returned? Well, the judge in the case is also weighing contempt. There's a lot of different contempt proceedings here that we could be seeing, and it's early in the Trump administration here for that. But the idea is, it appears the administration is doing, quote, nothing to carry out the return. Now, the Trump administration is appealing that original order, and they appear to continue to see if they can get away with defying the court, even though the Supreme Court unanimously said that, at least at the level of facilitate, a word that has become a matter of public debate, but the Supreme Court unanimously said that's what they should do, and they, as of right now, clearly are not doing it. To get into this and other big stories tonight, we have Congresswoman Linda Sanchez, Democrat of California, who's also on the House Ways and Means Committee. Welcome.
Thank you.
Great to have you. You have a lot of experience. Most administrations not only generally comply with court orders, but they always say they're trying. What does it tell you that the administration won't even request the return of this individual who's in the wrong place?
Yeah, well, I think Democrats have to face this hard truth that we are not dealing with a normal Republican administration. Every day, Donald Trump shows that he does not play by the rules. He tries to undermine our federal agencies. He tries to test the rule of law, and he tries to tear out the foundations of our democracy. So the fact that even the embassy in El Salvador, as I'm sure you're aware, Senator Van Hollen traveled to El Salvador, tried to meet with Mr. Garcia, was not allowed access. The embassy there says that the Trump administration has done nothing to try to secure his release. even though they admitted they sent him, they deported him because they made an error. And in this country, one of the underpinnings is that you are allowed due process in this country. Whether you're a citizen or not, you have certain rights before they can take away your right to freedom.
Right.
And they have disregarded this, which is shocking. And as per usual, Trump says one thing and then does another. At first he said, well, if the Supreme Court says I have to get him back, I will. And now they are continuing to do nothing. And it's setting up a real showdown in terms of co-equal branches of government. Now, Donald Trump tries to grab power. He tries to exceed his authority. He tries to disregard the system of checks and balances that our country was built on. And so it's really a showdown between he and the judicial branch, because let me tell you, the congressional branch, which is ruled by the majority Republicans, are doing zero oversight.
Right.
They are not holding him accountable for anything. So it's really the judicial branch that is the last standing check on his power.
Right. And that's why we're all keeping an eye on what the Supreme Court does if they see that they're being flouted. There is pushback, interestingly. I want to show some of what we've seen, even in pretty red areas, on Republicans on these very issues. Take a look.
You're going to bring that guy back from El Salvador?
All right. Thank you.
Do you support federal agents detaining students who are here legally?
I don't know that. Other things. You not be allowed it.
They're willing to let him do it, whatever he wants as POTUS. But some of the things he's doing are illegal.
Does that encourage you? And do you think there might be a larger set of resistance that we're seeing measured in many ways than some in the Beltway, or perhaps even some in the Democratic Party leadership realize?
Yeah, what we're seeing is Republicans are so afraid to hear from their constituents, because their constituents get the basics, that you can't just pick people up off the street, send them to a country into a maximum security prison, which is essentially akin to a death sentence, without some kind of due process. I mean, we have seen at Republican town halls, a few that have been held, constituents are angry. Now, they make up all kinds of stories. They say these are paid actors, these are activists that are busted from these are their constituents, and they're angry. To the point that Republicans are now hiding from their constituents. They've been told not to do town halls. And so we have seen other people go in and do these kinds of town halls to listen to what people are upset about and to try to get them to channel that anger into positive actions that can lead to a change of what's going on in this country.
You also work on a lot of different issues. I mentioned Ways and Means. There's trade policy, tariffs. California, people sometimes forget, in the rest of the country, is itself one of the largest economies in the world.
Yes.
Here's a headline about it's actually trying to sue the administration over tariffs. It could lose billions from Silicon Valley, of course, where you have the Magnificent Seven and other companies that we hear about, to agriculture. What do you see as the cost of this Trump tariff war thus far, and what should be done?
Sure. Well, we have seen a completely chaotic plan by Trump. There's no cohesive strategy to what he's doing with tariffs or how to get us where we're supposed to be. And the fact that California is suing, I have to say, again, the judicial branch, God bless them, they're the one check we still have on President Trump. It's actually Congress's responsibility, according to the Constitution, to have power over trade and tariffs. And he has really usurped that power by using emergency powers that are not appropriate in this case. So we are fighting back against that. California is a huge economy. We have a lot of businesses that are very dependent on Pacific Rim trade. As you mentioned, agriculture, Silicon Valley. So it has the potential to cost us millions, if not billions of dollars if these tariffs go into effect. They're going to affect consumers. They're going to increase the costs for consumers to buy goods. And with retaliatory tariffs like we are seeing with China, we are losing some of our biggest export markets for products that we produce, wines, etc. So it really has the potential to very much hurt California and the whole country. Now, the reasons that Trump has given for these massive tariffs are, number one, he says he wants to bring manufacturing back to the United States. Well, that's not going to happen overnight. And it's not going to happen without investments in workforce and facilities, none of which Trump is doing.
Right. It's sort of just a bullying of the world. There isn't like a plan on the home front.
Correct. And then the second reason he's given is because they need revenue. And why do they need revenue? Because they want to give massive tax cuts to people who earn over $400,000 a year. So they want to make consumers pay these higher costs so that they can give tax cuts to people who essentially don't need them. So when they say, is this tariff going to be temporary? Is it going to be permanent? We budget tax bills on a 10-year window. So if you're relying on that revenue in order to pay for tax cuts, that's not going to be a temporary tariff. You're looking at something that's probably long-term, and long-term is going to do huge damage to the United States.
Yeah, it's an important warning, and you're in these issues, and you see it, and you know, there's been so many different crises that after the market slump, we don't know whether the pressure will continue. The business pressure was huge on Trump because people saw it as a failed tariff policy. Congresswoman Sanchez, our leadoff guest tonight, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
Appreciate it. The Congresswoman mentioned Chris Van Hollen's diplomacy efforts. I should mention a programming note you might have seen on your screen. The Senator Van Hollen from Maryland joins Rachel Maddow tonight. So that's going to be, I think, a newsworthy interview we all have our eye on. What we're doing next is exactly what I mentioned to you, the dangers of these government cuts. It's not just regulation. It's not just today. We're talking about the risk of what security experts say could be Chernobyl-level events. Our special report on that with a little bit of Aaron Brockovich is next. Turning to our special report for you tonight, a lot of people don't like rules, especially when there's too many rules or rules that you find in your workplace or even at home don't really fit what you think is necessary. That's fine. It's understandable. But as cumbersome as rules or what we call government regulations can be, it is a well-documented fact, a nonpartisan, international, proven fact that when you have too few rules, or the wrong people get to cancel existing rules for their own selfish interests, you have something far worse than the idea that there's some annoying rules or regs around. You have huge danger. That is the point we're going to get into tonight. But let me start with the markets. We were just talking about this earlier tonight. We've been talking about it for weeks. Trump's trade war has the markets smoked, spooked, volatile, down. Indeed, to put it in context, reports show that the Trump slump is the steepest concentrated sell-off for American stocks, on par with both the speed and the intensity of the type of sell-offs or drawdowns, as they call them, Reuters points out, since the infamous and damaging financial crisis in 2008. And the Times reports bad news for Trump on this as people learn about it, that unlike that 2008 crash and the other one, what they call the two previous crashes of the past 20 years, this crisis, quote, would have been directly attributable only to one man, Donald Trump. So let's just take that in order. Pretty simple. The first point is Trump's policy failure is so bad that it is actually on par with massive global crises. The thing he did with his tariff idea was on par with a multi-year brewing housing market crash that cost a lot of people their homes and their jobs. The second point is relevant to our special report. That wider government cuts, slashing regulations, bringing a chainsaw to them, as Musk has literally claimed, have huge hidden delayed costs. Let me explain why. This is well documented. That 2008 crash, which was compared to Trump's tariff slump, was not exactly driven by politicians taking an action, but it was driven by inaction, or how politicians, especially on the right, but not only on the right, because some Democrats joined, how they disassembled parts of the government and slashed the rules for Wall Street and the housing market. And the Bush administration had many problems, you might recall, also was dealing with wars. But it was the Republican-led deregulation, which included the Bush administration and started even earlier, and we can show you the headlines, that proved to cause problems that didn't just shake the financial markets, they upended the global economy. And as I said, cost many people homes and jobs. Here's one report from NBC about how the Bush administration backed off the crackdowns you would have on no money down interest-only mortgages before all of this. And they, quote, buckled to pressure from some of the same banks that then failed in that crisis I'm mentioning. A California lender wrote to regulators a year before that implosion, expect fallout, foreclosures, horror stories, because there were no rules to ensure that people who couldn't afford mortgages weren't just getting them from greedy bankers who didn't care about externalizing the costs or the famous, terrible bailouts that the markets basically demanded. Bush also gutted the key Wall Street regulators. Keep that word in mind, regulators, because we're hearing a lot about Musk going after all the different regulators. Fewer cops on the beat, companies were getting away with risky practices for their own greed. But it would later be you, the public, and the government holding the bag, not the greedy corporations. Complicated story. You might have seen some of the movies about it. I'm going to show you one movie clip, but the point here is simple. When you take out all the rules and the people who enforce the rules, a lot of big, bad, greedy people can take advantage. Now, you might recall The Big Short, a movie based on the real events that fomented the clash. Now, there's a fictional scene that refers to the breakdown of government rules. It draws on, however, the reporting by a legendary journalist, Michael Lewis, who wrote the nonfiction book, The Big Short. So what I'm showing you is a dramatization of a real thing. No government cops on the beat. Housing bubble getting even bigger. And even when the signs were there, people who couldn't pay mortgage loans were being given ridiculous loans that the people giving them out knew they couldn't pay, which created the bubble that popped. Take a look.
So do applicants ever get rejected?
Seriously? Look, if they get rejected, I suck at my job.
Well, even if they have no money?
Well, my firm offers ninja loans. No income, no job. You know, I just leave the income section blank if I want. Corporate doesn't care. These people just want homes, you know, and they go with the flow.
Good for you.
Your companies don't verify.
If I write a loan on Friday afternoon, big bank is going to buy it by Monday lunch.
Yeah, same here.
No problem, right? Except there was a huge problem. That scene is showing those investors asking the questions that no government regulators were around to ask. Later, there were even Wall Street voices who admitted all the government cuts, this deregulation, this Musk-style attack on all these different things that we're not supposed to be thinking about every day because you're supposed to just have the rules enforced, ultimately kneecapped the needed oversight.
There were large portions of the financial system that were not adequately covered by the regulatory oversight.
You can say that again. The consequences of shredding those rules became clear. The collapse of the mortgage market, the cascading events you probably remember, major banks going under, which endangered all of the deposits they had, all the people's money. It was the biggest crisis since the Great Depression.
The country's second biggest subprime mortgage lender was teetering on the brink of bankruptcy today.
He has no idea how bad it is out there. He has no idea. He has no idea.
A record number of home foreclosures. 3 of the 5 biggest investment banks are gone. The country's biggest mortgage lender is gone. The 2 big government-sponsored entities, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, brought under government control.
Meltdown. The American financial system is rocked to its foundation.
It was a disastrous meltdown. It ruined many people's lives. There are people who never really got their footing again, never really recovered, never really got back to a place where they could own a home or get the right job. Some other people recovered. It took years. What you see there, and this is important because so often the news we're talking about today and maybe a little bit of tomorrow, but not the years back and the years ahead. What you see is the risk of what Trump and Musk are doing, because the story that ended with that meltdown started with disassembling government rules like the ones I showed you. A catastrophic failure with a lack of federal oversight that has been documented, studied, and proven. Again, nonpartisan point. It was the mess that actually also affected politics because it was an election year where Obama said there's a lot of things we got to change, and he came into office vowing to deal with, above all, that deregulation crash.
One of the most significant contributors to our economic downturn was a unraveling of major financial institutions
not adequately covered by the regulatory oversight,
and the lack of adequate regulatory structures to prevent abuse and excess.
The job of the public sector is to try to set up a set of rules that allow you to maximize the benefits of these innovations and minimize the damage.
Insured banks in this country are trading in derivatives on their own proprietary accounts. You could just put a roulette wheel in the bank lobby.
History in the making. The Dow plummets more than 777 points. Its biggest one-day point drop.
We lived through it, and we've learned a lot about the causes. And it is a tiny investment to have government regulation and cops on the beat. The disassembly of those government regulators and the regulations is what fomented and created the openings for what you saw there. And the problem is not specific to the United States. Let's take a look at another part of the world. It's a tale that you can go all the way back to Tocqueville for. The French aristocrat from the 1800s was exploring these concepts. Some of them were considered radical at the time, but take the old Soviet Union. That was a system that was more command and control, right? So unlike the American view of having checks and balances, something we hear about lately, here you had leaders like these guys running everything. And that meant sometimes that you also had under enforcement because you didn't have regulators who could say anything that was bad news to the people at the very top. And the deadliest nuclear accident in history, we know, occurred because there was a flawed reactor design and there wasn't the kind of systems and controls to both find the problem and communicate it internally, even if the guys at the top didn't want to hear it. It was actually immortalized in the miniseries called Chernobyl, about that Soviet nuclear plant. It's also sort of in modern day Ukraine, but that's a story for another day. But in 1986, it had that deadly, terrible explosion, sending clouds of radiation across Europe.
There has been a nuclear accident in the Soviet Union, and the Soviets have admitted that it happened.
There has been an accident at the Chernobyl atomic power station.
Massive explosion and fire killed 31 people. 135,000 people were evacuated from the area.
The level of the radiation in the area of the power station and the immediately adjacent area still remains dangerous to the health of people.
Historians, political scientists say that autocratic countries have more of these kind of problems. So you can think about that with what Trump has said he wants, including a third term. But specifically on these regulatory issues I'm telling you about, you didn't have enough safety measures. Dozens of workers died of poisoning. Thousands of cancer cases were found. There were international investigations and an exploration of the causes.
Most Soviet nuclear plants do not have containment buildings, the thick concrete dome structures Americans are used to seeing built around U.S. reactors.
It was officially considered that all Russian design are absolutely safe, and there is no need to have this containment.
The accident occurred during an unauthorized experiment with safety systems shut down. This followed several years of more than 70 violations found during safety inspections.
The rules were not ruling, so to speak, and there weren't regulations to force fast resolutions of those safety violations or, as you saw there, a requirement to build the reactors inside a containment dome in case an accident were to occur. Now, we even can tell you about a report from an international agency that said the lack of regulatory procedures was one of the key causes of the severity of the meltdown, the reactor brought to a state not specified by those procedures. Half a century after that failure, the plant is decommissioned. There's a productive dome, if you're curious. Protective area there you see. Evacuation zone, though, is still too radioactive for people to enter. And they've spent a ton of money on the cleanup. Now, I could mention the disaster ultimately led to some more international cooperation between nuclear powers, and after the fact, more safety protocols, better regulators, they say, in a country that since the Soviet era has, of course, evolved a bit, but had problems with exactly that. Do you have rules and do you have the people to enforce them? So why are we talking about nuclear safety? Why are we talking about that old 08 crash? Because this is actually the facts we have over history and the prism to understand the risk that Trump and Musk are posing. And maybe if that risk is better understood, we could face it before we actually hit a disaster. The good news on that is the conclusion of this special report when we're back in 90 seconds. Welcome back. Now to the conclusion of our special report. I promised you some good news, but it will take a couple minutes. It is 2025. But we've been reporting on the risks of these rolling Trump-Musk cuts to government staff and experts, critical safety systems, regulation. I gave some examples here. But consider how the danger of lax regulation was also brought to life for many Americans by the great Julia Roberts in the 2000 film about the great Erin Brockovich, delving into what might have been for many a seemingly obscure pollution case in the small town of Hinckley, California, and the severe health impacts that partly occurred for the same problem I mentioned earlier, the same Elon Musk approach of not having good, real environmental regulations enforced. Brockovich famously uncovered that.
I'm sorry. I just don't see why you're corresponding with PG&E about your medical problems in the first place.
Well, they paid for the doctor's visit.
Wow. Why'd they do that?
Because of the chromium.
Why'd they do that? Now, that town had toxic chemicals that was dumped into the water, and there was catastrophic fallout and not the right rules in advance to prevent what many viewed as a foreseeable, toxic, dangerous problem.
In the 1950s and 60s, PG&E admits it dumped 26 tons of a coolant made of chromium-6. The chemical is toxic and causes cancer.
Every community that I deal with that has been exposed to chromium-6, they have the same health symptoms.
I've had several stomach surgeries. I've had a hysterectomy. I've had several lumps removed from my breast.
This is a company that has great technology. They certainly have the money. You can't control this plume here in Hinckley after everything that's happened?
It's not complicated. Don't dump cancer, toxic stuff into places where people live. And the people in the position to know how toxic it was, of course, were the people who worked at the company and ran the company, but they were more interested in money. So there's a reason why rules enforced by the government exist in many countries to prevent exactly that kind of thing. Because if the company doesn't face those rules and real-time enforcement, they'll do what you just saw they did. And you or your children could end up sick or dead. I'm speaking very directly because this is the stakes. The company knew what it was doing. They even, after the fact, fought to avoid having to pay for health care for the thing they caused. The film even depicts a meeting between the Brockovich firm and the company where she goes after the company for what it did and calls their bluff on the fact that after the fact, they also deceived about the safety of the water.
These people don't dream about being rich. They dream about being able to watch their kids swim in a pool without worrying that they'll have to have a hysterectomy at the age of 20, like Rosa Diaz, a client of ours, or have their spine deteriorate like Stan Bloom, another client of ours. By the way, we had that water brought in special for you folks. Came from well in Hinckley.
Bars. PG&E, in the real world example, had to settle for what at the time was a huge amount of money, over $300 million. It was the largest such settlement at that time. Environmental regulators have tried to work to prevent that from happening to you. As the Erin Brockovich character said, again, based on a real person, people want to live their lives. They shouldn't have to think about this all the time. And if we don't slash all these government rules, they don't have to think about it. But that's the issue around those chemicals. Regulators were still fought by industry. California only recently became what is the first state to order a phase out of those chemicals in that same Hinckley community. Now, safety experts have long warned regulations are written in blood, meaning the history is bloody, injurious, or sometimes involves avoidable death. That there are dangerous consequences with lives at stake, and the rules come out of those past histories written in blood, but sometimes trying to ensure no more blood in the future. But you ignore them at your peril. This is the nonpartisan safety and security background to all of the Trump cuts that hit safety regulations, nuclear power plants. Deregulation, the Wall Street Journal says, will be a new high watermark. In other words, if true, if they get to where they want to go, they will deregulate more than ever before, which includes the examples I just showed you, and you saw the results. Now, the administration and its MAGA allies often say this is also about saving money, and you hear talk about the government being too expensive at the federal level. But many of tonight's examples show how corporations are often pushing against what they view as rules that cut into their money. not your taxpayer dollars, their profits. To say nothing of the safety of the people who live in this country and fund the government, and also, by the way, are consumers for those businesses. So with that in mind, I want you to notice now, I said sometimes you got to go back in history to then come back to the present. Who's leading this deregulation purge? It's a billionaire business person. Here's Elon Musk on regulations.
Regulations basically should be default gone. Default gone, not default there, default gone. And if it turns out that we missed the mark on a regulation, we always add it back in.
If we missed a mark, add it back in. Does that sound like a good idea once the toxic cancer chemicals are in the land? Then add it back in afterwards? Musk is leading an effort that is Donald Trump's plan and power. He is ultimately responsible. They're purging employees. They're eliminating the few people on the job that look out for your safety, including in toxic and nuclear contexts, enforcement of rules that do the type of prevention of exactly the catastrophes we've discussed tonight, which paves the way for the risk of those things happening again or worse. They're going directly after health agencies that do exactly the kind of screenings and rules that I talked about tonight. At home, Trump's health secretary has halted data collection on everything from cancer to HIV. Experts say we will be more vulnerable for years to come because some of these things have long-term consequences. They're also blocking data around vaccines. We showed you tonight harrowing examples of what it looks like when governments, ours or others, cut too many rules. It's dangerous for you. That includes the 2008 financial crash, which spread in all sorts of deep, long-term ways, includes contaminated water that got people sick, and the government oversight failures, and having people in charge who just want to cut all the regulators and deal with the bailouts and the bankruptcies later. So as they purge these agencies and cut funding, this could affect you, your health, and the well-being of the people in this country. I say that based on the facts and the history, without any view of partisanship or even the personalities involved, which sometimes get so much attention. If your problem with Elon Musk is that you don't like his style, that's a whole other conversation. But the problem we see tonight is that Elon Musk, empowered by Donald Trump, on behalf of a business history that doesn't like costly rules that cut into their profits, he is wrong. Wrong in ways that could prove catastrophic. We'll be right back. We're taking a closer look at the cost of the Trump-Musk deregulation and are joined by friend of the beat, political strategist Jay Komanduri. We went through a lot there. Your thoughts?
Well, I thought one of the most interesting aspects of that, you showed a lot of like the downsides and the potential catastrophic risks that the United States is now threatened by because of what Trump and Musk are doing. But those effects are not going to affect either Trump or Musk or many of their rich friends. Their enormous wealth inoculates them.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Trump can go off to Mar-a-Lago. Musk has that multi-million-dollar compound in Texas where he lives with 11 of his children and 2 of their mothers. You know, those negative consequences, they are not going to feel. And that actually is a big part of this. You know, our government is run by extremely rich people who can do things that they will not feel the consequences of.
You had made a comparison of Elon Musk and his chainsaw to Homer.
Right.
Let's take a look.
What, do you want to see my new chainsaw and hockey mask?
Oh, sorry. What am I thinking?
Yeah, I mean, you know, the way Bart was terrified at the sight of his father with a chainsaw, the way anybody would be.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the idea, what Musk is doing is also terrifying. It is, you know, it's an image that is rather humorous to see him running around with that chainsaw. He looks ridiculous with it. He looks like a total clown. But the problem is that the effect is not actually clownish. You know, if planes fall from the sky, if natural disasters are not responded to immediately and effectively, if a nuclear reactor were to melt down, all of those things are things that will affect normal people. It will not affect the super rich who are now leading our government.
So is there any political path here? I focused on the evidence and the facts, but if those facts resonate with people, you would think there might be a different amount of support for protecting our children rather than leaving them in danger so a chemical company can make slightly better quarterly profits.
Well, I mean, this is what's really complicated about this. You know, there's a line from Jonathan Swift where he says, I hate the animal called man, but I love my friends John, Peter, and Thomas, right?
Right.
So it's easy to hate or love things in general. It's much harder to hate or love things in specific, right? So it's easier to hate the government. It's easier to hate regulations. But you do love those specific regulations that protect the water, that protect the food supply, that protect the air. Talking about those specific real effects in a clear, consistent, direct way is really the way to connect what the government does and its necessary functions with the American people.
Well, it's funny you say that because we showed the Musk quote where he sounds a lot like an elitist using jargon. He says, if it default 0, if it goes too far, we'll add it back.
Right.
So you almost can't follow what he's saying. I translated that to the Brockovich example and say, if it's default 0, then they can dump the cancer chemicals into the ground,
right,
and it'll be there for years. Adding it back, adding the rule back afterward doesn't help anyone.
No, it doesn't. And so that's a great case where Musk is reading like as if it's a number on a spreadsheet. You know, if he gets it wrong, he simply corrects the spreadsheet without any recourse to actual real world effects. But I think that's very much by design. You know, part of what Musk and Trump are doing is they are creating a government that doesn't necessarily work for the people, but something that works for them, that works for Trump, Musk, Thiel, and their other rich friends.
Which is a hijacking, and it continues a point that we talked about populism and whether the Democrats got too cozy with too many big interests, when in fact, Sanders and others make the point that on the front end, you were too cozy with the banks. On the back end, you bailed them out.
Right.
And now you have billionaires trying to literally run the government and not living through those results. You also drew our attention to Succession, plots that intersect with reality. With the 30 seconds we have left, tell us why you wanted to look at this video. I should say, video. Yeah, this is just side by side. What did you want to say?
Yeah, no, what I wanted to say really was that, that's the result of having incompetent management. The rocket blows up on the launch pad, or it blows up in space. And then like the remains of the rocket hit normal, regular people. It doesn't hit the people who mismanaged it. You know, there is a real consequence to mismanagement, but there's also a danger to having somebody who's managing who in no way will feel the after effects of bad management.
Yeah. Some of what you said is discouraging,
right?
But you got to keep it 100, you know.
Well, there is hope here, you know.
What is the hope, briefly?
Well, the hope is that basically you're seeing it in those crowds that AOC and Bernie Sanders are getting. You know, there are Americans who don't like what they're seeing, who are energized, who are mobilizing, and that movement is growing.
It does get out, yeah.
And they have the right idea, which is we cannot give the government to people who will not be affected in any way by what the government does.
Yeah, who don't care about the public interest, which is the oath they take of office.
Exactly.
Jay, always great to see you. A quick break, and we'll get into Democrats fighting back on the retribution. We have new reporting on Donald Trump doing what he threatened to do and what some people minimized during the campaign, which is double down on his retribution against perceived opponents, sometimes in ways that may illegally abuse power. We've been covering how the courts will have to settle a lot of these questions. Now, today, the DOJ is doing something that is on its face a legal maneuver. They are allowed to try to bring enforcement actions against states. So that part could be okay. They're suing the state of Maine. They say that there was a violation of federal law by allowing transgender athletes to compete in sports deemed for women and girls, according to DOJ.
Today, the Department of Justice is announcing a civil lawsuit against the Maine Department of Education. The state of Maine is discriminating against women by failing to protect women in women's sports.
Now, whatever one's personal views on that, the steps I've shown you there are part of legitimate activities. In other words, the Justice Department can file these cases. They can make a civil rights claim, and then law, judges, precedent will resolve it. But there is more to these stories, as there often is under Trump. There is a standoff between him and Maine's Democratic Governor Mills. Take a look.
Is Maine here, the governor of Maine? Huh? Are you not going to comply with it? Well, we are the federal law. You better comply because otherwise you're not getting any federal funding.
See you in court.
Every state, good, I'll see you in court.
That's what the standoff looked like there. Fact check, misleading at best. When the President of the United States says we are the law or we are the federal laws, it's not true. If you want to be really charitable, you could say, well, he's using a turn of phrase, but the laws are what Congress passes and the courts enforce. And given everything else Trump is doing, going after his perceived enemies, when he says he's the law, watch out. Maine officials on the substance of this say there's actually only 2 defined transgender athletes in sports this year. They don't think it needs to be, as they say, a whole federal case. We'll be right back. We spent some time on the power of rules and the risk of the Trump Musk deregulation night. Tell me what you think about rules. Do we still need them for safety? You can hit me at any of our social media at Ari Melber on Instagram, Facebook, where we have an account, or TikTok even, if you like that, at Ari Melber. Do we still need safety rules in America? Let me know what you think of our report tonight.